The summer of 1945 brought with it the acrid smell of defeat across the Pacific. From the smouldering ruins of Saipan to the blood-soaked beaches of Okinawa, the Japanese Empire was crumbling. Its vaunted military machine, once unstoppable, now lay scattered across 1,000 nameless islands, leaving behind not just soldiers but civilians, women and children who had followed the imperial dream to its bitter end. Among these forgotten souls were women whose very existence challenged everything both sides believed about war, Japanese nurses who had sworn sacred oaths to die before dishonor, camp followers who had served the emperor's armies across the vast Pacific, comfort women whose suffering had been sanctioned by the state itself. Now, as the rising sun flag was lowered for what many believed would be the final time, these women faced something far worse than death, capture by an enemy they had been taught to fear more than hell itself. In the sultry heat of makeshift prisoner compounds, they waited. Some pressed their faces against chain-link fences, staring at American guards whose youth shocked them. Others huddled in the shadows of hastily erected tents, their minds replaying years of propaganda that painted their captors as monsters. For a Japanese woman to be taken prisoner was not merely a military defeat, it was spiritual annihilation. The concept of surrender, so alien to the Yamato spirit, weighed heavier on their souls than the tropical humidity that clung to their skin. The shame burned deeper than any physical wound. These women had been raised on stories of samurai wives who chose death over dishonor, of noble ladies who threw themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. Yet here they stood, alive, breathing, existing in a grey area that their culture had never prepared them for. Some whispered prayers, begging their ancestors for forgiveness. Others remained silent, wondering if they were already dead, if this purgatory of canvas and barbed wire was punishment for failing to uphold the sacred duty of their gender. As the Pacific winds carried the scent of cordite and decay across their temporary prison, none of these women could have imagined what lay ahead. They expected brutality, perhaps death. They prepared themselves for the savagery their own military leaders had promised them American soldiers would deliver. But in the coming days, reality would shatter every expectation, every fear, every certainty they had clung to in those first terrifying hours of surrender. To understand the shock of what was to come, one must first know who these women were before the world collapsed around them. Michiko had been a military nurse, trained in the ancient traditions of service and sacrifice. At 19, she had memorized the nurse's code, a document that explicitly instructed her to choose death over capture. She carried a small ceremonial blade, not for combat, but for the honorable end she was expected to choose should the unthinkable happen. Across the compound sat Fumiko, barely 16, who had been working in a military kitchen when the final retreat began. Her husband, a sergeant in the Imperial Army, had vanished months earlier during the chaos of Leyte. She clutched a small photograph, its edges worn from countless nervous touches, the only proof that her married life had ever existed. There was Keiko, whose haunted eyes spoke of experiences no propaganda poster had ever prepared civilian women for. She had been designated as comfort for officers, a euphemism that masked years of systematic abuse sanctioned by the very empire these women had been taught to worship. Her pregnancy, hidden beneath loose clothing, was evidence of trauma she could never speak aloud. Each woman carried stories that their captors would never fully understand. They had grown up in an empire that stretched from the frozen wastes of Manchuria to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific. They had been taught that Americans were devils, literally inhuman creatures who delighted in torture and desecration. Japanese radio had broadcast stories of American soldiers collecting ears as trophies, of mass rapes and ritual murders. These were not distant fears, but immediate, visceral terrors that had shaped every aspect of their wartime existence. The march to the prison compound had been a walking nightmare. Each step took them further from everything they understood about honor, duty, and survival. Some had tried to convince guards to execute them, believing it preferable to whatever degradation awaited. Others had attempted suicide, only to be prevented by medics whose motivations they could not fathom. Now, inside the wire, they observed their captors with the intensity of prey animals studying predators. These Americans were younger than expected, many no older than their own brothers who had died in distant battles. Some chewed gum, a substance they had never seen before, while others wrote letters home in a casual manner that seemed impossible to women who had spent years believing every moment could be their last. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be monsters, yet they shared cigarettes with each other, laughed at photographs from home, and showed what appeared to be genuine concern when prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or fear. It was as if the entire foundation of reality had shifted, leaving these women suspended between two incompatible truths. Inside the compound, as tropical storms lashed the canvas walls of their temporary shelter, several women carried secrets heavier than their fear of death. Hidden beneath loose-fitting garments salvaged from the retreat, the unmistakable curves of pregnancy had become their most dangerous vulnerability. In a culture where a woman's worth was measured by her purity and honor, these pregnancies represented not just physical evidence of trauma, but spiritual contamination that could destroy whatever fragments of identity they had left. Keiko was not alone in her condition. Yuki, a former factory worker from Nagoya, was 6 months along, the result of an assault by retreating Japanese soldiers who had abandoned all pretense of military discipline in those final chaotic weeks. She had not spoken since capture, communicating only through fearful glances and protective gestures toward her belly. At night, she could be heard whispering to her unborn child, begging forgiveness for bringing it into a world where survival meant shame. Sachiko had been married to a naval officer who died at Midway 3 years earlier. Her pregnancy was the product of a brief liaison with another widow, a desperate grasp at human connection in a time when death seemed the only certainty. Now, at 7 months, she could no longer hide her condition, yet she dared not reveal it. The other women suspected, but in their shared terror, no one spoke of such things aloud. The fear was not merely about American reactions to their pregnancies. These women had been conditioned to believe that capture itself was worse than death, and pregnancy in captivity represented a double violation of everything they had been taught to hold sacred. They remembered stories from China, where pregnant Korean women had been subjected to medical experiments. They recalled whispered rumors of American savagery in the Philippines, where entire families had allegedly been slaughtered for sport. Each night brought fresh nightmares. They imagined their unborn children being torn from their wombs, used as leverage for information they did not possess. They envisioned being forced to watch their babies suffer as punishment for their nation's sins. Some prayed for miscarriage, believing it would be a mercy for both mother and child. Others contemplated suicide, seeing it as the only way to spare their unborn from the horrors they believed awaited. The psychological torture was compounded by physical discomfort. Malnutrition was taking its toll, and the pregnant women worried constantly about their ability to nourish the lives growing within them. They hoarded scraps of food, sometimes going entire days without eating to ensure their babies might have a chance. Yet even this sacrifice felt hollow, as they believed they were merely prolonging suffering rather than preserving life. In the sweltering heat of the compound, time moved differently. Each day brought them closer to delivery, closer to a moment when their secrets would be impossible to hide. The discovery came not through interrogation or medical examination, but through human observation that transcended language barriers. Corporal James Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa whose own wife was expecting their first child back home, noticed the way Keiko held her side during roll call. Something in her careful movements, the protective way she positioned her arms, triggered a recognition that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with the universal nature of pregnancy. Mitchell had been raised by a midwife grandmother who delivered babies across 3 counties. He had seen that particular walk, that specific gesture, countless times in his childhood. When he approached Keiko with careful, non-threatening movements, speaking in the few Japanese words he had learned from intelligence briefings, her terrified reaction confirmed his suspicions. She expected to be dragged away, perhaps executed, certainly separated from the other women for whatever cruel purposes her propaganda-conditioned mind could imagine. Instead, Mitchell did something that shattered every expectation these women had carried into captivity. He called for the camp medic. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American doctor from San Francisco, had been processing the emotional complexity of treating former enemies while dealing with his own family's experiences in American detention camps. When Mitchell brought him to examine Keiko, Chen found himself face to face with a pregnant woman who was quite literally shaking with terror at his approach. Her fear was so palpable that Chen found himself speaking in Mandarin, then English, then finally resorting to gentle gestures that needed no translation. The examination revealed what everyone had suspected. Keiko was approximately 8 months pregnant, severely malnourished, and in immediate need of medical attention. But Chen's recommendation to his commanding officer was what truly defied expectations. He requested permission to establish a proper maternity ward within the compound. Major William Thompson, camp commandant and father of 3 daughters back in Oregon, faced a decision that no military manual had prepared him for. The logical, militarily sound choice would have been to transfer the pregnant prisoners to a general hospital, removing them from his responsibility and from the complex humanitarian questions their presence raised. Instead, Thompson made a choice that reflected not military doctrine, but human decency. "We'll take care of them here," he announced to his staff, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would ripple through both American and Japanese lives for decades to come. "These women are prisoners of war, and that means they're under our protection now." The word protection hung in the air like a prayer. For the American soldiers, many of whom had lost friends to Japanese bullets and bombs, protecting former enemies required a conscious choice to see past their uniforms and nationalities to their fundamental humanity. For the Japanese women, the concept of protection from their captors was so foreign it might as well have been spoken in an alien language. Yet as medical supplies began arriving at the compound, clean sheets, antibiotics, even a proper examination table, the impossible began to seem possible. The enemy was preparing to help them bring life into the world. The first birth came in the dead of night, during a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the compound. Keiko's labor began just after midnight, her suppressed cries mixing with the sound of rain hammering against canvas. The makeshift maternity ward, a partitioned section of the main tent equipped with the best medical supplies the American forces could requisite, became the stage for an event that would haunt and heal everyone present. Sergeant Chen worked by lamplight, his hands steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. Beside him stood Corporal Mitchell, who had assisted his grandmother during countless difficult deliveries in rural Iowa. The irony was not lost on either man. Americans who had been trained to kill Japanese were now working to bring a Japanese life safely into the world. Keiko's labor was complicated by months of malnutrition and stress. Her body, weakened by captivity and terror, struggled with the physical demands of childbirth. But when she gripped Chen's hand during the worst contractions, something passed between them that transcended nationality, race, and the brutal context of their meeting. She was a woman in pain, and he was a healer. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The baby's first cry cut through the storm like a proclamation. It was a sound that seemed to reshape the very air around them, the cry of new life in a place defined by death, hope in a space consumed by despair. Chen wrapped the infant in a clean blanket requisitioned from medical supplies, while Mitchell cleaned Keiko's tears of relief and disbelief. "It's a girl," Chen announced in halting Japanese, watching as Keiko's face transformed with wonder that she was alive, that her child was alive, that the monsters of her imagination had instead become midwives. Word of the birth spread through the compound with electrical speed. The other pregnant women, Yuki and Sachiko, watched through the partition as American soldiers brought food, clean water, and even small gifts fashioned from military supplies. A wooden rattle carved from bamboo by a supply sergeant from Tennessee. Baby clothes sewn from parachute silk by a radio man, whose own infant daughter was growing up without him half a world away. Within 2 weeks, Yuki delivered a son under similar circumstances. Her labor was shorter, but no less profound in its impact on the Americans who assisted. Staff Sergeant Williams, a medic from Detroit, wrote in his journal that night, "Today I helped deliver a Japanese baby. 6 months ago I would have shot his mother without hesitation. War makes animals of us all, but sometimes, just sometimes, it reminds us we're human." Sachiko's delivery came last, a difficult breech birth that required hours of careful work. When her daughter finally arrived, underweight but breathing, the exhausted mother looked up at the circle of American faces surrounding her with something approaching gratitude. She whispered a single word in English, "Thank you." And in that moment, every person present understood that they had witnessed something that would change them forever. 3 babies, 3 mothers, a dozen American soldiers who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people back home how they had discovered their humanity in the most unlikely place possible. In the days following the births, as new mothers recovered in the compound's makeshift maternity ward, an unexpected ritual began to emerge. The women started writing letters, not the official communications processed through military channels, but personal, desperate messages that seemed to pour from souls that had been silent too long. Keiko wrote first, her careful brushstrokes forming characters on paper provided by American supplies. Her letter was addressed to no one and everyone, a message to the universe itself, documenting the impossible kindness she had experienced. "The enemy soldiers delivered my daughter with gentle hands," she wrote. "They gave her blankets and food. I do not understand this war anymore." Yuki's letter was addressed to her dead husband, a sailor she would never see again. She told him about their son, about the American doctor who had saved both their lives, about the sergeant who had carved toys from bamboo. "I think you would be proud of your boy," she wrote, "even though he was born in the hands of those we were taught to hate." But the most heartbreaking letters came from Sachiko, who wrote to American officials begging to be allowed to remain in custody. The shame of returning to Japan as a former prisoner, carrying a mixed-race child fathered by trauma, seemed worse than permanent exile. "My daughter will never belong in the world I came from," her letter pleaded. "Perhaps she can belong in yours." The American soldiers wrote letters too. Mitchell sent a long, emotional message to his pregnant wife, trying to explain how delivering an enemy's baby had changed his understanding of what they were fighting for. Chen wrote to his parents in their American detention camp, describing how caring for Japanese prisoners had made him think differently about his own family's imprisonment. The letters created an invisible network of connection across linguistic and cultural barriers. Some were never sent, too dangerous or too personal for official channels. Others were forwarded through military mail, carrying news of impossible mercy to families who would struggle to believe such things possible. Major Thompson began keeping copies of the letters in his personal files, sensing that these documents captured something about the war that official reports never could. Years later, historians would discover these letters and recognize them as evidence of humanity's capacity to transcend even the most brutal circumstances. The babies themselves became living letters, messages of hope written in flesh and blood, proving that even in war's darkest moments, life finds a way to assert its fundamental value over death. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves, announcing Japan's surrender to the world. But for the women and children in the compound, the war had already ended weeks earlier, not with political declarations or signed documents, but with the first breath of newborn babies and the gentle hands that had delivered them safely. The official end of hostilities brought new complexities to their already surreal situation. As prisoners of war, they would eventually be repatriated to Japan. But as mothers of children born in American custody, cared for by American hands, they faced questions that no policy manual could answer. How do you return to a society that considers your survival a dishonor, when that survival came through the kindness of enemies? Keiko spent hours staring at her daughter, searching for signs of the father she could not identify. The child looked Japanese, but her existence carried the weight of impossible circumstances. In Japan, she would be a constant reminder of shame. In America, she would always be foreign. She existed in the space between worlds, a citizen of nowhere, claimed by a kindness that transcended nationality. The American soldiers were struggling with their own transformations. Mitchell found himself unable to write about the combat he had seen, instead filling letters to his wife with stories about babies and mothers and the strange peace he had discovered in helping former enemies. Chen requested assignment to continue medical care for Japanese civilians, finding in their treatment a purpose that felt more meaningful than revenge. Major Thompson received orders to prepare for prisoner repatriation, but found himself questioning every aspect of military protocol. How do you return women and children to a society that might reject them for having survived? How do you separate babies from the soldiers who had become surrogate fathers in the absence of biological ones? Some of the women made impossible choices. Sachiko continued to petition American authorities for permission to remain, willing to accept permanent exile rather than return her mixed-race daughter to a Japan that might never accept her. Others, like Yuki, began planning their reintegration, hoping that time and distance might soften the shame of their survival. The psychological war these women had been fighting since capture was ending not with victory or defeat, but with a complex peace that left everyone changed. They had expected to be brutalized and instead had been cared for. They had prepared for death and instead had given birth. They had braced for hatred and instead had encountered a love that asked nothing in return except the chance to preserve life. As preparations for repatriation began, none of them could have predicted how these wartime births would echo through the decades to come, creating families and connections that would span continents and generations. The ships that carried the former prisoners back to Japan in late 1945 carried more than bodies. They carried stories that would challenge everything both nations thought they knew about the nature of war and mercy. The 3 babies born in the compound traveled with their mothers, but they carried within their very existence a truth that neither country was quite ready to acknowledge, that humanity could transcend even the most bitter hatreds. Keiko returned to a Japan devastated not just by bombs, but by the psychological trauma of defeat. Her daughter grew up knowing she had been born in enemy hands, delivered by American soldiers who had shown more kindness than her own countrymen. This knowledge would shape her worldview in ways that rippled through generations. She became a translator, then a peace activist, spending her life building bridges between nations that had once sought each other's destruction. Yuki's son faced different challenges. In a Japan struggling to rebuild its identity after defeat, children born in foreign captivity carried a stigma that followed them into classrooms and job interviews. Yet he also carried something precious, the knowledge that enemies could choose mercy over vengeance, that soldiers could choose to preserve life rather than destroy it. He became a doctor, drawn to healing in ways his family attributed to the circumstances of his birth. Sachiko's petition to remain in American custody was ultimately denied, but her American military connections helped her daughter immigrate to the United States as a young adult. She married an American veteran, ironically a man who had fought in the Pacific Theater, and raised children who grew up knowing their grandmother had been saved by the very men their grandfather had been trained to kill. The American soldiers carried their own legacies. Mitchell named his first son after the Japanese baby he had helped deliver, creating a family tradition of names that honored the moment when enemies became midwives. Chen established a medical practice in San Francisco that specialized in treating Asian immigrants, work he always traced back to those nights in the compound when nationality had mattered less than need. Major Thompson kept the letters until his death in 1987, when his daughter donated them to the National Archives. They became part of a larger historical record that documented not just the violence of war, but its capacity to reveal fundamental human truths about compassion, choice, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. These children of two flags grew up to become bridges between worlds their parents had been taught to see as irreconcilable. They proved that even in war's aftermath, life finds ways to heal what politics and hatred have torn apart.